Hi, everybody. Welcome to the IRB mini conference. I'm Lisa Greening. I'm the Director of Regulatory Services. And with me today are some of the IRB staff and coordinators. So looks like we have about 19 people joined already. We'll give it a couple of more minutes. But let me share some information with y'all while we're kind of waiting for everyone else to join. So this is today's agenda. We'll have several sections here. We have presentations by several of our IRB specialists for these areas. And then we'll have a presentation also by Edward Gonzalez from OIT to talk about human subject electronic data and protecting it. And then we'll have a discussion of resources and just closing questions and remarks. At the end of the presentation today at the conference, we'll have what we call knowledge checks. So basically, these are questions about the materials that's covered today. And the first person to get the answer correct will win what we call a fast pass, which basically, when you do an IRB submission, it puts you at the beginning of the queue. So these are pretty handy to have. So, and we'll be using the chat function in Teams for the knowledge checks at the end. So that's so, pay attention and you'll be competitive for those fast passes. So also to receive credit for human subjects protection training, you have to attend the majority of the mini conference for it to count for that kind of training. So just keep that in mind too. All right. All right. It's 12:33. I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Oh, hold on. Make sure the sound is on.
Hi, everyone. Before the 1950s, there weren't very many policies or regulations that PIs were required to abide by. Research institutions often relied on a system of trust, where researchers were responsible for self-monitoring the ethical conduct of their own studies. Although trust is still a big factor in research today, there were numerous cases of exploitation, maltreatment, and abuse within biomedical research that weren't caught as early as they should have been. We will discuss a few of these historical cases that have shaped our human subject research policies and procedures today. In 1906, 20 Nazi physicians and 3 administrators were tried in Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity after conducting brutal medical experiments involving torture, mutilation, and killing of prisoners during World War II. 16 were convicted. The trial produced the Nuremberg Code, which established foundational principles for ethical research, voluntary informed consent, the right to withdraw, scientifically justified risk, and a prohibition on experiments likely to cause severe harm, disability, or death. Another defining case in research ethics was the Tuskegee syphilis study that occurred between 1932 and 1972. The U.S. Public Health Service recruited 600 black men, 399 with syphilis, under the false promise of medical treatment. Researchers deliberately withheld care, even after penicillin became the standard cure in 1947, and prevented participants from leaving the study. The consequences were devastating. Dozens died from syphilis, and over 100 died from related complications. Many suffered lifelong disability, at least 40 wives were infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The study continued for 40 years until exposed by the press in 1972. These events revealed catastrophic abuses of power, deception, and exploitation of vulnerable populations. They directly shaped modern IRB regulations by demonstrating the absolute necessity of informed consent, transparency, and the protection of human subjects. In this study, researchers at the University of Chicago conducted a study on jury decision-making processes, which involved audio recording jurors' private deliberations. The purpose of this research was to measure the influence that attorney comments had on jurors and their decision-making processes. The judge and attorneys at the recorded trials knew that the research was being conducted. However, the jurors were not told that they were being studied, so as not to bias their behavior. After the trials were recorded, the tapes were played publicly at a law conference. And the overall concern, as reported to the local newspapers, was that deception was used in a setting where privacy and confidentiality are critically important. These concerns resulted in the 1956 federal law banning all recording of jury proceedings. The ethical issues with this study is the lack of informed consent, the invasion of privacy and falsification of confidentiality, and the use of deception within a legal institution. A code of research ethics for conducting biomedical research were developed after the Nuremberg trials. This code of ethics was published in 1964 and were last revised in 2024. The Declaration of Helsinki states that in a research study, participants must not be denied the best proven intervention unless justified. Participant welfare always takes precedence over interests of science and society. Additional safeguards and considerations should be implemented when conducting research with vulnerable populations, and medical research conducted with a vulnerable population is only justified if the research is responsive to the health needs or the priorities of this group, and the research cannot be carried out in a non-vulnerable group. In addition, this group should stand to benefit from the knowledge, practices, or interventions that result from the research. Back in the United States, following the Tuskegee syphilis study, the National Research Act created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This commission was established to identify the basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects and to develop guidelines which should be followed to assure that such research is being conducted in accordance with those principles. The commission drafted the Belmont Report, a foundational document for the ethics of human subject research in the United States, and outlined the Code of Federal Regulations, adopted under the Department of Health and Human Services, Title 45, Part 46, Protection of Human Subjects. This title is also referred to as the Common Rule, and defines human subject research. The final revised Common Rule took effect on January 21, 2019, and the Common Rule outlines the requirements of and the guidelines for IRBs, as well as the policies for record-keeping requirements and the criteria for the review of research involving human subjects. Additionally, the Common Rule delineates the content of and requirements for the process of obtaining informed consent from participants, including those from vulnerable populations. The Belmont Report identifies three basic ethical principles for conducting research with human subjects: justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. When reviewing human subject research studies for approval, UTA always applies the Belmont Rule. The principle of justice states the selection of research participants should be equitable within the desired population and should not exclude a specific class or type of person who would likely benefit from the study. Anyone who could stand to benefit from the research should be offered the chance to participate and share the benefits of that research. The principle of beneficence states that researchers will make all reasonable attempts to secure well-being and to do no harm to the subjects. It is the researcher's responsibility to maximize possible benefits and to minimize possible harms or risks associated with the research activities. When appropriate, the researchers should make adequate provisions for monitoring the data being collected to protect the safety of the subjects and to maintain the confidentiality of the data. The last principle of respect for persons states that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and persons from vulnerable populations are entitled to these additional safeguards. Voluntary and informed consent to participate will be sought from each prospective participant or the participant's legally authorized representative, and it should be appropriately documented in accordance with the regulations. When appropriate, adequate provisions will be utilized to protect the privacy and confidentiality of participants. Additionally, participants will be given the right to withdraw from the study without penalty or consequence. An Institutional Review Board, or IRB, is an ethics committee that is created to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects. They ensure that there is a risk to benefit analysis to ensure the risks do not outweigh the benefits of the study. They ensure that adequate informed consent is sought from subjects, including requests for waiving or modifying the written informed consent process. They ensure there are adequate provisions for the privacy and confidentiality of the collected data, and they ensure the protection of vulnerable populations. The responsibilities of IRBs are formally defined in Subpart A of the Common Rule. Here's a list of the federal requirements expected of an IRB. An IRB must have at least 5 members of various race, gender, and cultural backgrounds, and must consist of both affiliated and non-affiliated scientists and non-scientists. Affiliated is referring to the institution in which the members serve, and an example of an affiliated IRB member would be a faculty member from the School of Social Work here at UTA. An unaffiliated member would be a member from the surrounding community that does not work for or have any affiliation with UTA. IRB members should have expertise in reviewing and evaluating research protocols and procedures. They should also have experience with vulnerable populations to ensure the subjects from these populations are being fully protected by the approved research. Lastly, IRB members should be familiar with the federal regulations, state and local laws, internal policies and procedures, and the standards of ethical conduct. The IRB at UTA is composed of 7 voting members and 15 alternate members, which consist of 2 unaffiliated members from the community. We currently have 3 physician consultants and 1 pharmacist consultant. These consultants assist the IRB with reviewing protocols that might require additional biomedical or pharmaceutical expertise that's beyond the scope of the IRB. These reviews ensure that the studies are being conducted safely and that the subjects are being fully protected. Our IRB consists of members spanning across various departments here at UTA. At this time, we currently have members from the departments of kinesiology, nursing, psychology, bioengineering, social work, education, physics, engineering, the Environmental Health and Safety Department, and the University Compliance Office. As mentioned earlier, we also have 2 unaffiliated community members that serve on our IRB. These board members are both from the city of Arlington, and one of them serves as our prisoner advocate. The IRB is responsible for the ethical review of research involving human subjects. The IRB has the authority to approve or disapprove all human subject research studies, to require changes to the proposed research, and to review any requested changes or modifications before they can be implemented. The IRB serves to ensure adequate informed consent is sought from participants, including pending modifications made to already approved written informed consent processes. Following approval, they also monitor and could possibly audit protocols and their collected data throughout the lifetime of the study, and they have the authority to suspend or terminate any study approval. The first thing that must be determined when we receive a protocol is whether it constitutes as research, and then whether it can be classified as human subject research. In this picture here, you will see our electronic protocol submission platform, Mentis. This is where you will house everything pertaining to your protocol application, consent forms, surveys, list of personnel, etc. But before we can discuss the ins and outs of the protocol requirements and your Mentis submission, we first need to discuss research. To begin, we should break down the definition of research. Research is defined as a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation, that's designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. A human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator, whether a professional or a student, is conducting research and obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual or through receipt of identifiable private information, even if no intervention or interaction with the researcher occurs. Information about human subjects can be collected in three ways: through interaction, intervention, or secondary use of private identifiable data or biological samples. Through interaction, researchers can collect data through communication or interpersonal contact with subjects. Through intervention, researchers can collect data through physical procedures or manipulations of the subject and/or their environment. Lastly, researchers can also collect data that was originally collected for a purpose other than the research purpose through the secondary use of private identifiable data or from biological samples. This slide shows a few examples of human subject research activities. So, any preliminary feasibility or pilot study, any form of interview, focus groups, surveys, or questionnaires that's asking subjects to provide their opinion on something or their feedback, any use of identifiable student or employment record reviews, any study obtaining physical or biomedical measurements, any form of psychological and/or social interventions, any form of clinical trial with or without drugs or devices, and any observations of behavior with or without research intervention. Some examples of studies that would not qualify as human subject research include oral history projects, class projects that are solely being submitted for a grade, or any quality improvement or program evaluations that are intended to improve or evaluate internal procedures or processes that aren't intended to contribute to generalizable knowledge. For instance, if you're assigning students to complete a project that requires them to conduct their own research or involves interaction with human subjects, but that project is solely being conducted to achieve a grade and will not be continuing once it has been submitted, then it would not be considered human subject research, and the students in your class would not need to obtain IRB approval. We've also received a few questions recently from faculty members who are interested in using assignments that students were required to turn in as a grade for use in future research. And our answer for this depends on the original intent of the assignment. If the assignment was given to the students with no intention of it being used in future research, then any project utilizing these assignments would be considered a secondary research project, which is human subject research that involves analyzing data that was originally collected by someone else for a different purpose, often without any direct interaction with the study participants. Researchers use secondary data to explore new questions, identify trends, or to validate findings while adhering to ethical guidelines to protect participant privacy and confidentiality. But if there is intent to use the submissions for research, and you know this before the students are given the assignment, then you would need to obtain IRB approval and before obtaining consent and issuing this assignment to students, because this would be considered a primary research project. It should be noted that for secondary research projects, any receipt, access, or use of completely de-identified data would not be considered human subject research and would therefore not require IRB review and approval. De-identified data would be any data set that only contains information about living individuals that has all the identifiers removed in a manner that any member of the research team would not be able to identify the individuals from whom the data was collected. Links between the data and the individual might still exist, but for instance, through a code or indirect identifier, but they are not readily accessible and would not be made available to the researchers at UTA. It should be noted that primary research studies, where the engaged researchers in that study are the ones implementing a coding system to replace direct identifiers with an indirect identifier like a participant ID, and intend to utilize a master list that will link the subjects and codes to their identifiable data would not be considered de-identified, but would instead be considered coded data. And we would still consider coded data to be a form of identifiable data. But the coding mechanism is considered an extra layer of protection for keeping the collected data secure. Should someone outside of the research team be responsible for removing the identifiers, and you're receiving the data in this way with no access to a master list or any other information that could possibly identify the subjects, then that data would be considered de-identified. There are lots of scenarios where the projects may fit in the category of human subject research or might not, but there are additional factors to consider that could potentially affect our determination of whether or not it would actually be considered human subject research. For instance, the intent or motivation of the project, the design of the project, the population, the benefits, or even the way the results will be disseminated. All of these factors should be considered when reviewing your project and determining whether it needs IRB review. This chart, which is available on our website, will walk you through the details of your project to determine what type of project the study would be considered and whether it would be classified as human subject research. If there are ever questions you have about your study and whether it would be considered human subject research that requires IRB review and approval, we are always happy to help with this. We just ask that you be as detailed as possible in your request for assistance so that we can walk through this table with you and make a determination. It's important to check with us if you have questions about whether your project requires IRB review before you begin the study. All studies that fit the definition of human subject research must be reviewed and approved by the IRB before any research can be conducted. One of the most important requirements for students who plan to conduct human subject research is to ensure that you have a faculty advisor chosen to assist with your project. The faculty advisor will be responsible for reviewing your submission before it gets submitted for IRB coordinator review. Once they've reviewed it, they will be the ones responsible for submitting all of your documentation for IRB review and approval. Students won't be able to submit projects to the IRB without a faculty advisor submitting it on their behalf. So yes, students can be listed as the principal investigator for the study or as the PI for the project, but the system will not let you proceed without having a faculty advisor listed in the protocol personnel. You can find further information about regulatory services and the different areas of research that we cover on our website shown here. From this homepage, you can access any of our pages on IACUC or animal subjects, IRB or human subjects, RCOI, research conflict of interest, export control, responsible conduct of research, recombinant DNA, dual use research of concern, and our important news and announcements page. Homepage for the IRB, or human subjects. From here, you can access all of our IRB resources that we have provided for researchers conducting human subject research. From here, you can access our Submitting an IRB Protocol page, which gives you an idea of what our review queue looks like, and I'll discuss this a little more on our next slide. And this is also where you can access the project comparison chart that I mentioned previously that assists you in determining whether your project will require IRB approval. You can also access our IRB forms and templates page, which houses all of our required documents for IRB submissions, as well as the pages detailing the responsibilities for principal investigators and faculty advisors. We also have a web page that includes guidance for researchers, which houses a lot of resources to assist researchers in understanding the requirements for IRB submissions, a page just for data security and tips for protecting human subject data. We also have web pages about our required training modules, our policies and procedures, and our IRB meeting schedule and IRB roster. Basically, this is where you're going to find all of our helpful content and resources that we have put together for researchers conducting human subject research. This page is a great resource. It contains step-by-step instructions for how to submit a protocol for IRB review and approval. The steps include reminders for what attachments and information should be detailed within the submission, and we've also included an FAQ section that answers some of our most frequently asked questions. One of the best things on this page is our Q tracker, and we update this page every week to include the number of protocols currently awaiting IRB review. This tracker serves as a reference for what researchers can expect as far as review times. And when we're experiencing a high volume of submissions, we will add a statement to inform researchers to plan ahead. When we're at a high volume, please expect submissions to take somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks to get through the initial review process. So please plan accordingly based on the information provided on our website. Also, when submitting a protocol, it's highly advised that you're submitting a protocol that's well written and includes all criteria for IRB approval. Submitting a protocol that's incomplete or lacking details may need to be returned to the PI and/or faculty advisor for revision, and this will further delay the approval process. We have great resources on this page to ensure your submission is good quality and goes through the review process quickly. The last thing I want to briefly cover is multi-site research and our IRB reliance procedures. You can find this webpage by visiting our Guidance for Researchers page and selecting multi-site research. This is a very helpful page for any investigator involved in research projects at other institutions or who plan to engage non-UTA collaborators on their study. If your study was reviewed and approved by another institution, then we would likely defer to them as the IRB of record for the study. Your duty as a collaborator from UTA is to submit the IRB approval letter and a copy of the IRB protocol application to us in Mentis. Once we receive your submission, we will reach out to the other institution on your behalf to initiate a reliance agreement. If your UTA study will take place at multiple sites outside of UTA campus, then you will need to list these sites in your protocol application with details about what procedures will take place at each of these sites, along with including a site permission letter to conduct research at each location if this is needed. If you're coming from another institution and you would like to transfer a study to UTA, there's a few questions we would need to ask in order to determine how we proceed. For instance, if you were the PI on this study at another institution and there are no other personnel listed on the study, then it is likely that your other institution will be opting to close it. In this scenario, we would ask that you submit the IRB protocol application and all of our required forms for UTA IRB to review the protocol and approve it. Unfortunately, the process is not as simple as transferring the IRB approval to another institution. If you are not the PI for the study and/or there will be active personnel who will continue carrying out the research at the other institution, then all that will be needed from the UTA researcher is to submit the IRB approval letter and a copy of the protocol application to us in Mentis. Just as I mentioned earlier, this would be for us to determine whether we will need to conduct our own review of the study or if we can initiate a reliance to rely on the determination of the IRB at the other institution. These situations can be tricky, so we're always happy to go over this with you if there's any questions you have while you're working through your submission. We also offer some great guidance on our web pages, especially the one that's shown in this slide, which can be accessed by following the link provided at the bottom.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Okay, our next presentation is, let me see, informed consent and recruitment. So let me cue that up.
Lisa, I don't think the presentation is pulling up.
Okay, let me see what the problem is. Did it start at all?
No.
Okay. Let me try again.
The investigator or designee responsible for obtaining consent has several responsibilities. Hello, my name is Kelly Handy, and I am one of the IRB specialists at UTA. In this section of the conference, it looks like the sound shut off.
I don't know what the issue is. Kelly, do you happen to have the presentation pulled up and maybe you can share
Yeah,
it?
let me go ahead and try to do that. Guess I'll just
And the trick there is when you share, you include the sound so it plays.
Hello, my name is Kelly Handy, and I am one of the IRB specialists at UTA. In this section of the conference, I will discuss the basics of informed consent and recruitment. The requirement for informed consent. Sorry about that. The requirement for informed consent is based on the principle. Sorry about that. Give me 1 second here. Could y'all hear it?
Yes, I could hear it.
Okay. Hello, my name is Kelly Handy, and I am one of the IRB specialists at UTA. In this section of the conference, I will discuss the basics of informed consent and recruitment and talk about the importance of consent in research. Earlier, we talked about several times that research violated the rights and welfare of subjects because they did not understand that they were participating in research, or they were not given an opportunity to choose if they wanted to participate in research. Because of these ethical breaches, we now have established principles designed to protect research participants. The requirement for informed consent is based on the principle of respect for persons, which is one of the ethical principles described in the Belmont Report. Respect for persons requires that subjects have the right to make informed decisions about what happens to them. Informed consent is defined as the process of communication between an investigator and a research subject, where the subject is fully informed about the research and they are given an opportunity to decide if they would like to participate. This process starts the very first time a researcher contacts the subject, such as through an advertisement, about the study, and continues throughout the entire life of the study. Usually, informed consent is presented as a document that the researcher will discuss with the potential subject to ask them to participate in their research study. During this process, subjects are fully educated about the study procedures in a manner that they can easily understand, including the risks and benefits. During this process, subjects are given an opportunity to ask questions about the study, and they are given a chance to say no or choose to ask more questions before deciding whether to participate. Their voluntary willingness to participate is then documented, and that is typically done by signing the consent form. UTA requires that all IRB submissions involving the collection of data from human subjects to include a plan for informed consent, regardless of study classification or review type, because this is fundamental to protecting the rights and welfare of subjects. Informed consent is a process that involves two parties, the principal investigator and the potential subject. The PI involved in informed consent is primarily responsible for making sure that every subject is properly recruited and undergoes the full process of informed consent. They do have the option of delegating this responsibility to fully trained research personnel, but as the PI, they are still ultimately responsible for the informed consent process. It's also important to note here that research personnel who obtain informed consent should be appropriately trained, very knowledgeable about the research activities, and able to answer questions about the study. So the principal investigator should take precautions to ensure anyone responsible for informed consent is well trained. The investigator or designee responsible for obtaining consent has several responsibilities that are important to making sure consent is properly obtained. Researchers should describe the study procedures and timeline accurately and explain what participation entails, regardless of the complexity of the study procedures, whether it's a survey, focus group, or collection of a biospecimen. Participants need to be given time to think about the study and ask questions before they decide to enroll. The language used should never be coercive and should instead focus on accurately explaining the purpose and the background of the study. Researchers should also avoid undue influence when obtaining consent. What this means is that if a researcher has a position of authority and they are consenting someone in a position that does not have that same level of perceived authority, the potential subject may feel unduly influenced to sign the consent form. An example of this type of relationship is a professor trying to recruit a student. This doesn't mean that a professor cannot recruit a student, but rather that the professor needs to take precautions to ensure the student is not being influenced to participate. The consent form needs to be written in lay terms that someone without a scientific background can easily understand. A general rule of thumb to follow here is that consent forms should be written at an 8th grade reading level. Finally, consent needs to be properly documented. Typically, this is a signature, but when specific conditions are met, the IRB can approve other forms of documentation of informed consent, such as checking a yes/no box to indicate consent. Consent should be documented exactly as described in your IRB protocol. The informed consent document is required to contain several elements to ensure that subjects are presented with appropriate information about the study. These are federally required elements of consent and should be included in each consent form regardless of the study. The consent form should state that the study is research, the purpose and background of your research, including how long it's going to last and all the research activities, because those things allow potential participants to know if the research is a good fit for them and their lifestyle. Your consent should also explain the risks and benefits of participating, both for the subject directly and for society. This is very important because people need to fully understand the associated risks before deciding to participate. The consent form should also clearly state the participation is voluntary and participants can withdraw consent at any time with no penalty. The consent form should describe any alternative options to participating in the research. Consent should also include a description of confidentiality and explain how research data will be maintained. The document needs to explain who has access to inspect the records outside of the research personnel and explain how any collected paper or electronic data will be kept secure and how long it will be stored after the study is closed. The consent form should also contain information about compensation, or if their participation will incur any costs that they will be responsible for, like parking costs, for example. For research that involves more than minimal risk, the form should also explain whether any compensation or medical treatments will be available in case an injury occurs. Consent forms should also address whether the researcher plans to use their data for future research purposes that are not described. Subjects should know if their samples or data will be stored and used for future research purposes that are not described in the consent form. And finally, consent forms should also include contact information for the research team so participants know who to contact if they have questions or a problem comes up, or if they change their mind about participating in the study. The consent form should also include the contact information for the IRB for questions or to report a complaint about the study. All of these required elements need to be written at an 8th grade reading level in simple language that a non-scientist can understand. UTA has informed consent document templates on our website to fit every study type, and these documents contain all of the required elements of informed consent. Here is a screenshot of our website where you can find our templates we have for different types of studies. Each of these templates contains all of the required elements of informed consent that were just discussed. We have one for adults, we have a condensed version for minimal risk studies, 2 for clinical trials and biomedical studies, one of which is for federally funded studies, and we also have a form for studies with both parents and children. Finally, we have a broad consent template which can be used in limited circumstances for storage, maintenance, and secondary research of identifiable private information or biospecimens where the specific future use is not yet established. If you are unsure as to which template is appropriate for your study, please feel free to reach out to us for assistance. And just remember that when you use our template, always download the most recent version from our website so you don't use an out-of-date version that has old information. So just to recap the last few slides, informed consent is the process whereby a researcher shares information about a study with a potential subject and gives them time to decide whether they would like to participate in the research. After making their decision, participants document their decision by signing the informed consent document. After subjects provide consent, the researchers should also give them a copy of the consent form for their reference. Documenting consent is very important because it records that the researcher appropriately presented consent and that the subject is deciding to participate of their own free will. If you are the researcher, make sure that you are documenting consent in the manner approved in your IRB protocol. Okay, so what we just talked about covers the basics of informed consent for adults, but some studies may also want to recruit children or individuals under the age of 18. Children are a potential vulnerable population because they have limited autonomy and are more at risk of various harms in research, so they require additional protections when they are research subjects. Instead of consent, which we just talked about, children need to provide what is called assent to participate. Assent is the term used to express willingness to participate in research by people who are too young to provide informed consent, but old enough to understand the proposed research and the activities expected of them as subjects. In Texas and in most states, people under the age of 18 cannot provide assent by themselves. So if the research involves children or minors, the researcher will also need to obtain consent from the child's parent, in addition to obtaining assent from the child, if they are old enough to understand what you are asking of them. If the age range of the child you are recruiting is older and has the capacity to understand your research, it's likely appropriate for you to obtain both parental consent and assent from the child. In some cases, like if the child is too young, or if they lack the capacity to understand the research, the IRB may waive the assent requirement. The next thing we are going to discuss is what to do if you need to alter the informed consent process. In some cases, there are elements of consent or documentation of consent that may be waived. The researcher will need to submit a waiver, and the IRB will make a determination on whether elements of consent or documentation can be waived for this specific study. The IRB will review these waivers on a case-by-case basis, and it's important to remember that submitting a waiver does not guarantee that it will be approved. The IRB may grant your waiver in specific circumstances and with appropriate justification, but just submitting a waiver does not necessarily mean it will be approved. The researcher has to provide sufficient justification to the IRB, and that can vary depending on your study. To request a waiver or alteration of the required elements of consent, the IRB will need to see that these 4 conditions are met. First, that the research is no more than minimal risk. The waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of participants. That the research could not be carried out without the waiver. And when appropriate, participants will be provided with additional information after their participation. Some studies may want to waive documentation of consent. These conditions needed to waive documentation are a little bit different because the IRB will need to see that at least one of these conditions is met. That the only record linking the subject and the research would be the consent document, and the principal risk would be potential harm resulting from a breach of confidentiality. That the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside of the research context. Or if subjects or legally authorized representatives are members of a distinct cultural group or community in which signing forms is not the norm, that the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects, and provided there is an appropriate alternative mechanism for documenting that informed consent was obtained. So the type of waiver the researcher submits will depend on what portion of the consent process they wish to alter. The IRB will make a determination on whether to approve the waiver after reviewing the justification that the researcher provides. I mentioned that waivers to consent are determined on a case-by-case basis by the IRB. There are limits to when consent can be altered or waived. I want to go over a few reasons or justifications that the IRB would not accept a waiver or alteration of consent. First, convenience. Researcher convenience or difficulty is not an appropriate reason to justify waiving consent. Participants have a right to make decisions, and it's important that their rights and welfare are protected. Second, cost. Cost is also not a sufficient reason to waive consent because ethical considerations take precedence over cost. Speed. It can take time to cover informed consent with participants, but this is not a reason to waive the requirement. The IRB may suggest ways to obtain consent in a more efficient manner if a researcher is concerned about cost or speed, but these alone cannot be used to justify waiving informed consent. And finally, the risk level alone. Just because a study is minimal risk does not mean that consent is optional. A minimal risk study still involves some level of risk that a participant would not otherwise have if not enrolled. So unless other criteria are met, even minimal risk studies should still obtain consent. If you have concerns about how to obtain consent for your study, I suggest reaching out to our office with any questions because we would be happy to provide guidance on consent and whether a waiver or alteration is a good choice for your study. Okay, so moving on to recruitment. Recruitment is the process of advertising your study to find subjects that are interested in participating. Like I mentioned before, recruitment is where the consent process begins because consent starts the moment a subject sees your recruitment materials. You have a lot of flexibility here to use whatever method or material is necessary to share your study with the public. You can use flyers, emails, ads on social media like Instagram or Facebook, television, radio, or you can simply rely on word of mouth methods to recruit. The researcher should choose the method that makes the most sense to reach their subject population. One thing to note here, if you will be posting on private social media pages or private listservs or accessing information that is not publicly available, the IRB will need to see a permission letter stating that you have permission to access that information or post on that particular site before the recruitment method can be approved. UTA does not have templates for recruitment since this is going to be unique and tailored for each study. While we don't have a specific list of elements that you must have, there are a few general rules to keep in mind when you're designing recruitment material. First, the recruitment documents should be somewhat brief and limited to generating interest in your study. So you'll want to briefly describe the study and the goal in a way that generates interest. The materials should include information about subject eligibility and the type of subject the researcher wants to enroll. So if there's a particular age range or medical condition or occupation, for example, that should be listed on the flyer or other recruitment material so potential subjects can see if the study is applicable to them. Some researchers also want to include information about compensation, which is a good idea, but it is important to not put undue emphasis on it. The material can provide compensation information, but that shouldn't stand out more than the rest of the information. Researchers designing recruitment material should make sure that all the information in their materials is accurate and not unduly influential. This is important because when the IRB reviews your recruitment materials, they will be checking to make sure the benefits to participation/compensation are not overstated or presented in a way that would cause undue influence on subjects. So in closing, informed consent is an ongoing process that ensures participants understand the study and voluntarily agree to participate. This process begins the first time that a participant sees recruitment material and continues throughout the life of the study. IRB approval is required before recruiting participants or obtaining consent. Remember to always use the most up-to-date IRB approved forms. Recruitment and consent must be ethical. All forms used must avoid coercion, use clear language, and prioritize participant rights and welfare at every step of the research study. If you have any questions, you can let us know in the chat, or you can reach out to our office later for guidance on consent and recruitment. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, Kelly. And all right, we're going to jump right into our next section. And this is the section on preparing an IRB submission and the IRB review process. So I'll hand it over to Angie to queue up.
This section of the presentation will discuss how to prepare your IRB submission and provides a breakdown of the IRB review process. I will discuss the process step by step from the start of the application to the closure of the study in Mentis. It is important to give yourself a sufficient amount of time to prepare your protocol submission before any expected or anticipated deadlines. In the next few slides, I'll discuss some things that you should consider. This is our Submitting an IRB step-by-step guidance page. This is a great resource to utilize if you are new to the submission process or if you just want to double check that everything you have prepared is ready for review. Within each dropdown, we have included information about each step of the submission process. And at the very top of this page, we also post the number of protocols that are currently in our queue awaiting coordinator review. This is a great indicator for how busy our office is and gives you an idea of how early in advance you should plan to submit your study for the approval process. Student PIs at UTA are required to have a faculty advisor listed on their protocol. Once a submission is complete and ready for IRB review, the student PI will be required to submit the protocol to their faculty advisor in Mentis. It is the faculty advisor's responsibility to review the submission, ensure everything is accurate and complete, and then they will be responsible for submitting the protocol on the student's behalf for IRB coordinator review. If you're a student, it's important to communicate with your faculty advisor regularly throughout the submission process to ensure that your protocol is being reviewed and submitted for IRB review in a timely fashion. If edits or corrections are needed, It is possible that the faculty advisor may return it back to you to make these changes before we even receive it in our office. Communication is definitely key to ensure these things are moving smoothly throughout the review process. If you are a master's student submitting a research protocol, our office advises that you submit the protocol at least one semester before your planned graduation. If you're a doctoral student, we advise at least 9 months in advance. The reason behind this suggestion is because our office cannot guarantee the IRB review process will be completed in sufficient time if you do not plan ahead. In other words, improper planning would not be a justifiable reason for the IRB to review your study ahead of the other studies awaiting review in the queue. All protocols are reviewed in the order they are received. Just a reminder that you can check our Submitting an IRB Protocol webpage to find our queue tracker. While this doesn't necessarily give you a definite timeline to prepare for, it does give you an idea of how busy our office is. The higher the number, the longer you will need to wait in order to receive a preliminary review. At this time, it's fairly normal for our queue to be in the 30s. At the beginning and end of a semester, it should be expected that this number will be higher than normal. So keep this in mind while you are preparing for your submission. The second step in the submission process is ensuring that all personnel and collaborators on the project have completed their required training for the type of protocol you are submitting. It's also important to consider whether any previously completed training has expired and needs to be renewed. In the next few slides, I will discuss some of our training modules, when they will be required, and how long each module is valid for. HSP training must be renewed every 3 years. This is a requirement for all researchers, UTA personnel, and non-UTA collaborators. If your study has non-UTA collaborators engaged in the research, they will not be able to access our HSP training in Mentis. In order to access that website, they will need UTA login credentials. All non-UTA collaborators should provide a copy of their HSP training completion certificate that was completed at their institution or through another training platform like City Program. We have a multi-site and IRB Reliance webpage that can be accessed from our IRB homepage, and here you will find a list of equivalent modules as well as links to modules that we recommend for collaborators that are not affiliated with another institution. Again, regardless of their role in the study, any researcher engaged in human subject research must have active HSP training. Some studies may require personnel to complete additional training. For instance, if your study will utilize NSF funding, you may be required to complete the Responsible Conduct of Research training or RCR training. If your study has NIH funding or will utilize funding from any other PHS compliant agencies, you may be required to complete both conflict of interest training or COI training, as well as a COI disclosure. If your study has a clinical trial or if it will utilize any FDA regulated drugs or devices, then good clinical practice training or GCP training will be required for all personnel. Our office will inform you if any of these additional training requirements will apply, and if you would like to plan ahead, you can find this information listed on our website as well. We also have 2 different web pages specifically devoted to PI or Principal Investigator responsibilities and Faculty Advisor responsibilities. It is important to read through these responsibilities if you are planning to conduct research here at UTA. These responsibilities are expected of any researcher planning to serve as a PI for a research project, regardless if they are a faculty member, staff, or student. If a student will serve as the PI for a study, the faculty advisor listed on their study also has oversight responsibilities to ensure the research is being conducted ethically and in accordance with the approved protocol. Both of these pages can be accessed from our IRB homepage. The next step in the submission process is ensuring that all required forms have been completed and are ready for IRB review. This includes the protocol application, the consent form, and any supplemental documents that may be required for the type of protocol you are submitting. In the next few slides, I'll discuss the required forms for an IRB submission and where each of them can be located. The next step in the submission process is to ensure that your submission has a completed IRB application form and an informed consent document. Informed consent is required for all research studies. We have different types of consent documents and templates for each type posted on our forms webpage. Your submission should also include copies of any data collection instruments that you intend to use in your study. This includes copies or screenshots of any surveys, the script or list of questions that will be asked during interviews or focus groups, as well as any recruitment language or materials that you plan to use. If you intend to utilize non-public contact information, you will also be required to attach permission letters or communication granting you permission to utilize the non-public resource for research purposes. A few examples of this may include access to a listserv, private social media groups, or recruiting from other institutions or private entities. We have two different protocol applications. The first application shown on the left is our primary research application, and this application should be used for any research study with humans that will involve either interaction with subjects or a form of intervention. The application on the right is our secondary research application, and this application should be used for any research study that will use private or identifiable data that have been collected or will be collected for non-research purposes. This would include use of information from a data bank or records, or utilizing biospecimens or excess blood from a lab. There are prompts at the beginning of each application that describe what type of research each application should be used for. But if you have any questions about what type of research project your study would fall under, please feel free to reach out to us. Please ensure that all questions in the application have a response, even if you are just notifying us that certain portions of the document do not apply. If an incomplete application is received by our office, we will return it back to the PI for edits, and upon resubmission, it will be entered into the bottom of the queue. If you have questions about some of the sections and how to provide a response, please feel free to reach out to us before you submit. The first section of our protocol application is where you will list all collaborators who will be interacting with subjects or who will have access to identifiable data that are not affiliated with UTA. Along with listing each collaborator in the first part of the application, the non-UTA collaborator will also be required to complete a non-UTA collaborator form that provides details about the institution they are affiliated with, their role in the study, and where data collection procedures will take place, and contains their contact information. Each collaborator will also be required to provide proof of HSP training completion. This can be provided from a module completed at their institution or from one of the provided training module options listed on our multi-site research and reliances page. For each collaborator engaged in the research, our IRB will contact their institution to initiate reliance procedures. This is basically an agreement between institutions that one IRB will rely on the review determination of the other IRB that will serve as the reviewing IRB for the project. This eliminates the need for researchers to obtain review and approval from both institutions for the same study. While our office does this on the collaborator's behalf, it is also important that the collaborator communicate with their own IRB to ensure they are compliant with their requirements. The second question on the application requests PIs to provide an estimate for when the study is expected to begin and when it is expected to end. It's important to note that no portion of the human subject research project can begin until IRB approval is obtained. This includes subject recruitment. The next section is where the PI will add their funding source. It's important to list all funding sources that will be utilized for your project to ensure appropriate regulations are being applied. For any external funding sources, a Mentis Blue Sheet number will be required for each award. If you are offering subjects any form of monetary compensation, there must be a funding source listed. The next section is about the risk classification for your project. To determine how your project should be classified, we refer directly to the definitions. Minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests, and that confidentiality is adequately protected. Greater than minimal risk refers to research activities that do not meet the definition of minimal risk. Researchers will be asked to assess the risk level of their data collection procedures and indicate the risk level it falls under. The fifth question of the application is where you explain the primary research questions, hypotheses, and objectives that will guide the study. This section should clearly explain how the project meets the criteria of human subject research. The procedure section is very important and is one of the most common areas that IRB coordinators will return a protocol for. This section of the application should detail each data collection procedure in a step-by-step fashion from the very beginning of the research to the last communication. This section should include what data is being collected from subjects during each procedure, where the data will be collected, how the data will be collected, and when. It's important to note that this section should not appear as an overview or a summary. It must clearly detail each procedure. Also, the descriptions provided in this section should use clear and concise layman's language that can be easily understood by someone outside of your field. This may require additional definitions, explanations, or even pictures. This section should clearly display how many study visits will occur, what data is being collected from subjects in this research and how. If interviews or surveys will occur, the platform should be listed, and how subjects will be asked to access it should also be clear. If any portion of the study is being recorded, the type of recording should be clear, as well as what data is being captured. If there are optional elements to your research, or if the research is integrated into a course and is required for subjects to receive a grade, regardless of whether or not they choose to participate in the research, this should be fully detailed. Lastly, if your study will contain a lot of procedures, it's recommended to list the expected duration of each procedure in the description. Otherwise, in number 7 of the application, you should clarify how many visits and/or interactions with the subjects the study will contain, the amount of time required for each visit, and how long their total participation is expected to take over the entire duration of the study. It's important to ensure that the information provided in this section is consistent with details provided outside of your protocol application. For instance, if you provide an estimate here of a survey taking 5 minutes, but the consent form estimates a range between 5 and 10, the study will be returned. The estimated duration should be consistent across all documentation. The Alternatives to Participation section is intended to describe any available options that participants have if they choose not to participate in the research. An example of this would be if completion of your study will compensate subjects with extra credit. It is required for an alternative assignment to be offered to students in that course who are interested in obtaining extra credit but who do not want to participate in the research. The alternative non-research option offered to students should be an assignment that requires equal effort, time, and awards the same amount of extra credit. The location and sites portion of the application should include all places where research procedures are expected to take place. If your study will take place in a lab, the building and/or room number should be provided. Specificity depends on the type of procedures being conducted in that lab. If your study will take place online, websites, platforms, apps, and software should be listed in this section. If any part of your study will take place at another institution or a location administratively separate from UTA, then a permission letter allowing the research to be conducted at this location should be included with your submission. In the personnel qualification section, all members of the research should be listed, as well as their role in the study and their relevant qualifications, training, or experience they may have to fulfill that role. The study oversight section is where the PI is expected to describe the communication plan with all listed personnel to ensure that all study procedures are being conducted ethically and in accordance with the approved protocol. If the PI is a student, this section should also include how the faculty advisor will oversee the student conducting the research. In the population section, the target population for the study should be described. For example, this could be subjects living within DFW, UTA students, and/or healthy young adults. In the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the eligibility criteria should be described. Inclusion criteria should describe the requirements for subjects to be eligible to participate in the study. The exclusion criteria should explain specific factors or criteria that would make the subject ineligible to participate. This section should describe how you intend to verify eligibility. For instance, will you be utilizing a pre-screening survey, listing the requirements in the recruitment materials, basing it off self-reporting, or are you utilizing a different method? The number of subjects you intend to enroll in your study should be a best estimate based on the type of study you intend to conduct. For minimal risk research projects, this is viewed as an estimate, and it's allowable to exceed this amount over the course of the study. If the research is greater than minimal risk, the estimated number should include the statistical justification and/or references for how this number was obtained. This number will also be viewed as a cap, and enrollment cannot exceed this number without an approved modification. The recruitment strategy should be described from first contact with a potential subject to the subject participating in the study procedures. This section should include all methods utilized to recruit subjects and how you will obtain their contact information if you are not planning to utilize publicly available information. For instance, if you have access to a listserv, or if you would like to recruit subjects from a course that you are teaching, a permission letter that allows use of these platforms for the purpose of research should be attached to your submission. If someone's going to share your recruitment materials on your behalf and private contact information is not being provided to the researchers, then a permission letter would not be required, but this should be clearly stated in the application. All recruitment materials should be listed in the application and attached for review in the submission. If you are recruiting by phone or in person, the script that will be used or the flyer that will be used to guide the discussion should be attached for review and approval. If you are planning to use subject pool posts like mTurk, Sona, or Prolific, the information posted about your research in those platforms should also be provided as part of your recruitment materials. The informed consent process is one of the most important parts of the research study. It's important that subjects are provided with sufficient information to understand the requirements of their participation and how their data will be collected and used. It's also important to note that you cannot obtain information about a person through another individual, such as from a family member or a friend, unless that person has also undergone the informed consent process themselves. In this section, describe all elements of the process: when it will happen, where it will happen, and how subjects will be providing their consent. If you're conducting a survey where subjects are just hitting "I agree," this would require a waiver of the written consent documentation requirement. In 17A, we want justification for why you are requesting to waive this. If your study is federally funded or FDA regulated, you will also need to attach the form. If you are intending to waive portions or elements of the consent process, this will also require the form with your provided justification and how you intend to document consent. This is a copy of our minimal risk consent form template. As you can see, we have included a lot of prompts in red text that are intended to assist you with providing all required details for this document. You simply need to plug information from the application into the consent form. Please be sure that any details that you are providing in your consent form are consistent with the details you have provided in your application. One of the most common return comments for consent forms tends to be that the study title is different or the eligibility criteria is too brief. We've even seen different compensation types and amounts between the consent form and the application. So please double check that everything is consistent before you submit it for review. It should also be noted that when you submit the document to us for a review, all of the prompt language should be removed. Our office needs to review the document exactly how it will be issued to the participating subjects. This includes the way you intend to document the subject's consent. If the consent form requires a handwritten signature, we will stamp the most recent version of the consent form with the approval date and the version number. If the consent form does not require a signature or if it will be embedded into a survey, we typically do not stamp the consent form. Incomplete disclosure occurs when an investigator withholds information about the specific purpose, nature, or other aspect of the research. Deception occurs when an investigator gives false information to subjects or intentionally misleads them about some key aspect of the research. If you plan to utilize this in your study, you will need to provide your reasoning and whether subjects will be debriefed at the end of the study. This should also include the language or the statement that will be issued to subjects at the end of their participation. Please describe all details about your compensation method. This should include how much subjects will receive and whether it will be prorated for partial participation. When the compensation will be issued to subjects and how. Will they be receiving it in person in cash? Will they receive a gift card through email? For all methods, describe how it will be documented and how confidentiality will be maintained. If you are planning to utilize a raffle, clarify how this will be conducted and how the winners will be notified. If the compensation amount for participating subject groups differs in any way, you have to describe why. And if a subject does not answer all questions in a survey or leaves early, will they still qualify to receive compensation? All of these details should be considered and described in both the application and the consent form. Compensation tends to be our number one reason that our office receives complaints. The risk to subjects section should clearly detail any actual or potential risks that subjects will encounter while participating in your study. This could be physical risks like falling or muscle soreness after exercise, or it could be psychological risks that may cause the subject to feel depressed, angry, or embarrassed while participating. There could also be social risks associated with participating in the study, especially if their identity will be known by others who are participating in the research. If you are conducting the study online or utilizing virtual platforms, there's always a potential risk to confidentiality. Also, if you are planning to recruit friends in your research, or if you are a teacher and you plan to recruit students that are enrolled in your current course, this could have influence on whether the potential subject decide to participate in your research or not. They may feel pressured or influenced based on the relationship dynamic. For each risk described, a strategy for minimizing it should be included in both the application and the consent form. Recently, we posted a new mental health resource that can be utilized by researchers, and this is now available on our website. If your study will involve blood draws, radiation, or x-rays, or utilize any devices that contain lasers, then additional approval from the Environmental Health and Safety Department will be required before the IRB can issue approval. For each procedure that applies to this section, the location, the exact materials or the equipment used, how blood, body fluid, tissues will be handled and stored, etc. This last section should contain a list of direct benefits the study may have on subjects participating in the research, as well as the expected or potential benefits that this research study will have to the field of study or the society at large. Be sure to address all aspects of subject privacy and confidentiality. Privacy refers to a subject's right to control access to themselves. So in other words, how will you conduct your study procedures to ensure the subject can maintain as much privacy while participating as they feel comfortable? If you're conducting an interview, are you ensuring that it's in a private place or controlling the environment in a way to prevent any situation where they may be exposed as a research subject or embarrassed? Confidentiality, on the other hand, is the researcher's responsibility in protecting subject data and ensuring that it is not disclosed without their permission. In this section of the application, we want to know what type of data your study will contain. For instance, will it contain names and recordings that would be directly identifiable? Will you collect identifiable data but later replace it with a coding mechanism to further protect against data breaches or exposing someone as a research subject? Will the subject be utilizing a pseudonym while participating that de-identifies that data from the research team, but is still linked to that participating subject across all procedures? Or will you be conducting a survey that collects no identifiers at all, and there's no way to know who is participating in your study? This section of the application should describe exactly how and where all paper and electronic data will be stored for the entire data retention period. It should be noted that data can only be maintained on UTA-sanctioned encrypted devices or software, unless additional exceptions are granted. We will be discussing these exceptions and considerations for data security a little more at the end of the presentation. If the PI is a student, or if it's known that the PI will be leaving UTA before the end of the data retention period, a long-term storage arrangement should be described in this section. If any part of your study could result in identifying child abuse, elderly abuse, communicable diseases, or criminal activities that would or could not have otherwise been identified, how do you plan to maintain confidentiality, and what is your plan of action if any of these are revealed? The data sharing section should provide details about any identifiable data collected in the study that will be shared outside of the research. If the study has data sharing, details should include where, when, and to whom the data will be shared. The last question on the application asks researchers to describe any actual or potential conflicts of interest. In other words, whether the PI or any of the protocol personnel have an affiliation, arrangement, or financial interest in the research that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. The end of the application serves as a reminder of some of the documents that may be required and should be submitted with your application in Mentis. This includes any surveys, questionnaires, interview questions, instructional materials, recruitment materials, permission letters, or documents for non-UTA collaborators. The IRB must review and approve any documents that will be issued to subjects as part of the research. It should be noted that if you are conducting a survey, a link in the application directing us to it can be helpful in some instances, but it is a requirement that screenshots or a PDF version of the survey be attached to the protocol submission in Mentis. This is our device form. If your study will utilize any medical devices, each device should be listed in this table, as well as the FDA status of the device and whether your study intends to test the safety or effectiveness of the device. All manuals and other relevant safety information for each device should be included in the submission for IRB review. Additional details about these requirements, along with definitions and further guidance on making these determinations, are included within the document and can be found on our Forms and Templates page. Once your application and consent form have been completed, you're ready to start the submission process in Mentis. The next few slides will walk you through the submission process. Once your submission is ready for IRB review, you will need to upload all of your documents into Mentis. This is an example of what a human subject research protocol looks like within Mentis. You will be assigned a protocol number and be required to list all UTA protocol personnel that will be engaged in the project. By clicking on the green Show Details button next to each researcher, you will also be able to view their training completion dates. And this is a helpful way to ensure that you stay on top of reminders. The box on the top right is filled in by the IRB staff following preliminary review. Mentis will require you to provide a protocol title and a brief summary of your project. Please ensure that the protocol title you intend to use in Mentis is consistent with the title you plan to use across all documentation. Lastly, you will be required to upload your protocol application, consent document, and any other data collection instruments or supplemental documents. This is the bottom of the submission. Here you will note that we have included a comment box. This can be used by the PI or researchers to add additional information that may be pertinent to the review. It is also the section of the submission where you will receive return comments from the IRB staff informing you of any missing details or documents or requesting edits or corrections. Our office does not get prompted when a comment is uploaded in the submission. We will not review this information until it is undergoing preliminary review. So if there's any time-sensitive information that we need to know about your study, please reach out to our office directly. Once the IRB has received a submission, many researchers wonder what the review process looks like. In the next few slides, I will describe the review process from the moment it is received in our inbox to when approval is issued in Mentis. This is our review flow chart that describes the pathways for the different types of human subject research that we review. Most of the studies we receive are minimal risk. And minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in the subject's daily life or during the performance of a routine physical or psychological examination or test. Greater than minimal risk would refer to research activities that do not meet the definition of minimal risk. The third option shown is reliance, and this is an agreement between institutions when UTA personnel are engaged in research outside of UTA. By knowing what category your study falls under, the flowchart, which is available on our website as well, will give you an idea of the pathway that your study will likely follow while being reviewed. Most studies are minimal risk and do not need to be reviewed by an IRB member or reviewed at a convened IRB meeting. If the study is greater than minimal risk, it will likely require review at a convened IRB meeting. If the study has federal funding or FDA-regulated devices or drugs, then it is likely that a single member of the IRB will need to conduct a final review of the project in order for you to receive approval. The IRB staff will inform you if your study requires review at a convened IRB meeting. When conducting a review, the IRB will consider whether the potential or actual risks are being minimized to the fullest extent possible. They're also ensuring that the potential or expected benefits justify exposing subjects to the risks outlined in the study. The IRB will review all data collection procedures to ensure that each step of the procedure is clearly detailed. The IRB will consider the type and amount of compensation being issued to subjects and will ensure that it is reasonable and fair. The IRB will also consider the type of data that will be collected in the study and whether the outlined security measures are sufficient in protecting subject privacy as well as subject confidentiality. Following a preliminary review of the submission, the IRB specialist will likely return the protocol back to you to request any necessary revisions or clarifications. Once it is sent back to you, Mentis will send a notification email. You can view the request for revisions or clarifications in the comment section of your protocol submission in Mentis. Once you have completed all necessary revisions, you will need to resubmit the protocol for a final review. If your protocol is minimal risk, or if the study has federal funding and qualifies for review under one of the exempt categories, then the IRB coordinators will be able to issue approval. If your protocol will be reviewed under one of the expedited review categories, once the IRB coordinators have deemed that the study is ready for approval, they will send the protocol to a single member of the IRB who will either review and approve the protocol or return it back with conditions for approval. If your protocol is greater than minimal risk or requires review at an IRB meeting, the IRB coordinator will inform you of the meeting date your protocol will be reviewed at. The IRB meets every second Tuesday of the month. Once you've been issued IRB approval, it should be noted that additional steps may be needed or should be considered. For instance, if you need to make any changes to the documents approved in your original protocol, a modification will need to be submitted for IRB review and approval before the change can be implemented. This would include any changes to the study procedures, questions on a survey, changes to recruitment strategies or materials, or any changes to compensation methods or amounts. A modification will also be required if you need to change the study PI, faculty advisor, or a specially qualified personnel member. These personnel members have a specialized role in the study and the qualifications and/or training necessary to perform that role. For instance, the personnel member on your study that will conduct blood draws or that will be responsible for communicating with non-English language speakers. If you need to change, add, or remove any of these types of personnel, a modification will be required before the change can be implemented. Lastly, your study may require an annual continuing review. If your study requires this, you will see a protocol expiration date on your study in Mentis, and your approval letter will inform you of this requirement. Our office also reaches out with a reminder to researchers that have studies with this requirement. And if required, the IRB will need to review the amount of subjects that have been enrolled in the study so far, how many have withdrawn and why, and whether any unanticipated problems or non-serious adverse events have occurred. if you experience any unanticipated problems or serious adverse events while conducting your study, this should be reported to the Office of Regulatory Services by email immediately. Once you have fully completed your enrollment, subject follow-up, data collection, and any data analysis of identifiable data, then you will need to request to have your protocol closed in Mentis. It's very important that you do this, as the data retention period does not begin until you have an IRB closure date. You can request to have your study closed by submitting a modification or by emailing our office. It should be noted that any identifiable data collected in your study should be maintained for the full data retention period. If you have no intention of utilizing the identifiable data for analysis, and you are only planning to store it for data retention requirements, then you are still able to close your study. Again, all data collected in your study must be maintained for a minimum of 3 years from the IRB closure date of your protocol in Mentis. It is important to note that if you are a student who will be graduating soon, or if you plan to leave UTA before this period is up, someone at UTA must be responsible for maintaining the documentation for the rest of the retention period. If you are a student, this is typically your faculty advisor.
All right, great. Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break for everybody. And we'll return, let's say at 2:15. So we'll see everybody in a little bit. Okay, welcome back, everybody. The next section I'll present on, and it's on modifications and noncompliance. So let me share the slides I have for that. All right. So Angie touched on this a little bit in her section on the IRB submission process, but I wanted to expand on this a little bit for everybody and talk about what a modification is and how that process goes. So a modification is basically any change to the research plan or protocol or proposal you've gotten approved by the IRB. So all studies that have gotten IRB approval, if there is a change to the protocol or the plan, you have to get that change reviewed and then approved by the IRB before you can do that change. So this includes very small changes, which I'll go into in the next slide. But just keep that in mind that changes to what you said you said to the IRB you would be doing with human subjects need to be reviewed and then approved by the IRB, including studies that were determined to be exempt. Now, exempt is a whole category of research that people get confused about, and we have actually a guidance webpage about what it means to be determined exempt for a research protocol. People get this confused with a research protocol that doesn't require IRB review altogether. So, but we have a whole guidance page on that on our list of web pages if you need information about that. So, even studies that are determined to be exempt, if there's a change to the protocol, procedures, or the plan, or what you plan to do, that needs to be submitted for review and approval. Now, if you fail to get IRB approval for those changes prior to doing them, that's considered a protocol violation and noncompliance. So what kind of modifications or changes are we talking about? So this could be procedural changes to a protocol, additional removal of study sites, change in your recruitment methods like a new flyer, change to the PI or faculty advisor, change to the funding, and then any changes to study documents like the informed consent document or recruitment materials like a flyer, like I said. So these types of changes are common in modification submissions that we see. But really just anything that's changed in your in how you're going to conduct the research needs to be reviewed and approved. Something new that we have, a new procedure that we have for changes in personnel is when there's changes to personnel that it doesn't include the PI or faculty advisor or especially qualified personnel, that's not an equivalent to what you're replacing it with. Those don't need to be submitted to the IRB for a modification approval. Instead, this is the responsibility of the principal investigator. Now, we've had this new procedure for a few months now, and we've given specific training and presentations on this new procedure. That's also listed in our YouTube trainings, and you can find it's about a 20-minute presentation specifically on this topic and personnel changes. And then we have a link here too. So if you have a question about whether a change to your protocol requires IRB review, please reach out to the office and ask. I think sometimes with the gray areas about like changing, especially like recruitment materials or things that just need to be updated over time, investigators forget that needs IRB review and approval. So this is just something to keep on top of, that as you're doing your study, any changes or refinements that you're doing to procedures or documents, that needs to be IRB approved. So here on this slide, I've copied the steps on doing submitting a modification to the IRB. So these modifications are submitted in Mentis. So that's the same system that you would use to submit the protocol initially. And the steps here are you find that protocol that you want to modify, and then you start the modification review. And so this has a form, a smart form that you fill out. You fill this out in its entirety and make sure that in the summary of a modification that you list all the modifications that you want to do to the protocol and that you want to have approved. The specialists look at this, and that's what they're going to look for in your track change documents and what you've changed in your protocol. Let's see, make sure you attach all the documents that you've changed so that the IRB can review it. That is part of the record of the modifications. When you're doing a modification, say for instance, you're changing a procedure, make sure that you look at not only the application for the changes that need to be made, but also the consent form to make sure that that's updated as applicable. Now, if you're changing a procedure, or maybe you're adding a procedure, make sure you look at all the sections of the protocol application that this would apply to. So of course, it would be the section about the protocol procedures where you would add that. But then also like the section with data collection or controls or security, if this adds a unique data point that needs extra protection. And then every change that you make in the protocol application is reflected into the consent form where necessary, and that there's proper permission for that additional procedure. And then after you're done modifying everything, you've uploaded the change documents, you would save and submit your modification for IRB review. And the IRB receives this modification request. They look at the funding that it has and the regulatory status and the risk level of the whole protocol to understand what this change means to the protocol. So sometimes there's a protocol that is greater than minimal risk, but the change that's being proposed is a change to maybe a minimal risk procedure. And so there's different pathways that the IRB can use in reviewing that. So that it doesn't necessarily need to go to the full board for review. And like we've mentioned before, and I think in this presentation and today, not everything goes to the full board for review. So same with modifications, not everything goes to the full board for review. So there's many options that the IRB has in reviewing these types of any changes. Now, if you've submitted a modification and there's some questions for you about the modification, the submission will be returned to you in Mentis, just like it's the review process was for the initial review. And we ask that you complete the revisions as soon as you can and resubmit the revised documents back to Mentis. Once you receive notice from Mentis that your modification has been approved, you're good to go, and you'll find a copy of your IRB approval letter uploaded to your modification in Mentis. So that's how that process goes. Again, I'll reiterate, it's important that none of the changes that you propose are initiated until you've gotten that clearance from the IRB that's okay to do going forward. Now, there are some carve-outs for when there are changes that need to be done for subject safety. And those instances are pretty rare. And if you encounter a situation like that where there needs to be something implemented right away for subject safety, contact the IRB office, contact regulatory services as soon as you can to talk to a specialist about this concern so that we can guide you and help you in that submission, and then also alert the IRB reviewers that are going to be part of that process. So that's a conversation that we'll have to have specifically for that. But most of the time, modifications don't fall under that emergency or where there's an urgency to get something approved by the IRB. So this is the standard process. Now, let's talk a little bit about non-compliance in human subjects research. So non-compliance is basically when there is when the protocol is not followed as approved, or the PI is not following what the IRB determined in a research review. So non-compliance, and we have these definitions on our webpage, but non-compliance can either be minor non-compliance, where it doesn't put the subjects at increased risk, or the IRB can determine that the non-compliance is serious, where something's happened where the violation of the non-compliance has increased the risk to subjects or and violated their rights. Non-compliance can also be continuing. This is where there's a pattern of non-compliance over multiple instances. And this is separate from being serious. So something can be minor non-compliance. And then if it's not compliance, not compliance, then it's serious non-compliance and or continuing. So something can be serious but not continuing, or serious and continuing non-compliance. And then this process, the report of non-compliance is reviewed either by internal IRB staff, where we collect information about the possible non-compliance. And then if it's serious and or continuing, that's when it goes through more IRB reviewers and the board to make these determinations. So some common non-compliance findings that we've had is kind of the bigger ones you would think of. Failure to obtain IRB approval. This is when a research protocol isn't submitted to the IRB for review and approval, where it wasn't, the IRB determination wasn't sought altogether. Another one is failure to obtain informed consent. So this is where this could be several things, where there is research done and it wasn't IRB approved, and then thus you haven't gotten informed consent for research. Or you've included subjects. You have an approved protocol, but you've included subjects and you haven't gotten their informed consent like you said you would in your protocol application. Probably our most common one is failure to follow approved protocol procedures. Like I mentioned about modifications, the IRB approves your research plan with the understanding of everything that you've described would go, that's what you're going to do, that's your plan. And then we've found in some non-compliance cases, people deviate from that, where they don't do some procedures or add procedures or change to procedures, and they don't submit that to the IRB for review and approval. And so this kind of leads into the next common finding is implementing changes prior to the protocol without prior approval. So I think this just reiterates the importance of monitoring your protocol once it's approved. When you conduct it, make sure that everybody knows what's IRB approved so that there's no deviation. And so this next slide is about that, some kind of tips and practices for compliance. So make sure that you have thorough documentation within your research record of how you're carrying out the research protocol. So when a research protocol is drafted and approved, there should be documentation supporting all the procedures and conduct of the research that you proposed. So, of course, the big ones are consent form documentation. And of course, if you're doing any interventions or interactions with the subjects, then there's, of course, documentation about how that went, what data you collected. That should be clear documentation on your side within the research record. There should be regular training of study personnel, people who are collaborating on the protocol. This should include protocol-specific training. So today we've done some human subjects protections training where we've talked about informed consent, the importance of that, the IRB review process, things like that. But that's just very broad training. What I mean by protocol-specific training is what do your study personnel need to know to carry out the protocol specifically, like the procedures. Say, for instance, there's a survey instrument or a depression scale. Make sure that they know how to carry out that survey or how to do that scale. How do they, make sure you train people on how to obtain informed consent for this particular study and answer questions if that's been delegated out to other people or they're part of the informed consent process or a part of recruitment. Make sure that they are able to answer questions if they are interacting with subjects. And there should be clear communication within the study team. This is just a best practice, I think, across the board with all work in research. But when there are changes made to the protocol, make sure that everybody's notified about that. If there's a new consent form, make sure everybody knows that there's a new consent form or revised consent form, or if there's a change to something in the procedures, or if there's a new flyer, make sure that's communicated to the whole team to prevent some of those common findings. Now, sometimes non-compliance happens. And that's just the nature of humans doing research with other humans. So when that happens, we'll suggest some corrective actions. And a lot of times this is helping the investigator identify the failure points in whatever internal processes they have and suggesting improvements. And then also correcting the study record. If this impacted, study data or perhaps the consent form or the consent form processes or recruitment. And then also identify any necessary training or retraining. This is the go-to oftentimes with non-compliance. We look to see that there's some kind of refresher on the processes or a specific kind of training to prevent the non-compliance from happening again. So in non-compliance and preventing non-compliance, the role of the IRB is really to provide training where we can and offer guidance on preventing non-compliance. And then we'll help in communicating regulatory policy or procedural changes to the research community so that when there is a change at the institutional level, when there's change to requirements, that's communicated to the researchers. So we do that through the research newsletter and also the PI listserv. And the PI listserv is the listserv we have from Mentis. So anybody who's a PI in Mentis, we regularly send out communications using those names. And then also the IRB monitors compliance in several ways. So whenever there is potential non-compliance, we encourage investigators to report that to our office so that we can assess it for non-compliance on behalf of the IRB. And then we're always here to answer questions about what are the requirements of the IRB, if there's a question about something in your protocol, to understand whether or not something is allowable or clear, or if you're looking to make a change. We're here to help so that there's no non-compliance or a deviation from your protocol. Okay, so we have a little bit of time before our next speaker. So I wanted to use this time to see if there's any questions that y'all might have. And you can put that in the chat if you're a little too shy to ask it. We'll also have some time at the end of the mini conference for questions. Yes, this this is being recorded right now, and we'll put it on our YouTube page after today. And also, all the attendees will get the slides from this presentation. All right. Well, it looks like, oh, I was still sharing my screen. Let's see. Question. I might have missed it, but is there an informed consent template? Yes, that's on our forms page. We have several templates depending on basically what your protocol is, if it's like a clinical trial or if it's like maybe, minimal risk. So we have different forms, but yes, we have a template, and I'll put that link here in the chat here in a second. Oh, Kelly put it in there. Okay, well, I just got word that our next presenter is ready to go, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Edward.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. Hopefully you can hear me. The thumbs up. You can hear me. Awesome. Nodding
Yes.
head, that works too. Awesome. It's one of those days where I've been going from place to place. Thanks for letting me be a part of the IRB mini conference. I'm Edward Gonzalez. I'm the Director of Research Support Services in the Office of Information Technology. And I appreciate the invite every semester to talk to y'all a little bit about data safety, using the right tools with your data, and really how to interact with some of the IT services here at UTA. So, of course, if you have any questions, I will glance at the chat from time to time. And of course, there will be a little Q&A at the end. Let me get my screen shared. Looks good. That's terrible. Sorry about that. Let me try that again, because y'all don't need to see my little pop-up. There we go. That's much better. Okay. So, kind of a bottom line up front, keeping your data safe. First and foremost, use UTA provided tools. And so when we talk about doing work at UTA, the institution has already vetted, purchased, acquired, configured a wide number of IT tools for your use. So if you don't do anything else, make sure that you're using those UTA provided tools, as you need different components to handle data for your research here at UTA. But we also understand that sometimes you're going to have to need a tool that isn't necessarily already in our toolkit. Make sure that you ask for help with those. Don't just assume that it is okay to use something that you buy yourself or that you acquire yourself, something that you've heard a friend or a colleague use, maybe, something that you may have used at your last college or institution. There's a whole process that has to happen when we talk about, is it okay to use UTA data with a particular product company? We'll get into that. Students and faculty who supervise students and student employees, make sure that we're being thoughtful about using the right identity. We'll talk a little bit about this more, but student identities come to an end at the happy conclusion of your course of study when you graduate, but then after that, we may not be retaining your OneDrive, we may not be retaining your chats, those kinds of things that you did in Teams. Employees, so faculty, staff, administrators. This also includes things like GRA roles. When that separation happens, when you no longer work for the university, again, those identities don't persist. So be thoughtful about which identity you're using with, particularly if you're setting up sharing, particularly if you're using some of these tools using a UTA student or employee identity. And I want you to keep in mind that all projects, including research projects, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we want to be thoughtful at every stage along the way about the tools that we're using, where we're putting our data, and the decisions that we make. So digging into this a little bit, use UTA provided tools. So all of these assume that you log in using your UTA issued net ID and password, or email address and password. Files and file sharing, please use UTA's OneDrive and SharePoint. This is really an excellent way to keep your data safe, because once you're putting all your data up into a OneDrive folder, you're syncing it up to the cloud. You can even deal with some things like happening to your personal laptop, or happening to your computer, because if all that data syncs up into OneDrive, or you're using SharePoint, if you have a group, then that's one less thing that you have to worry about. UTA SharePoint is already approved for most of the normal variety of data that we're going to encounter. The big exception to that is regulated data, regulated or restricted data. We'll touch on that in a minute. But if we're talking about the normal kind of human subjects research data that especially we're talking about here at the IRB mini conference, using UTA's OneDrive is A-OK. And that's really the preferred way that we want you to not only store your data, but let's say that you need to share your data. You need to share your data with a GRA who's working on your research team. You need to share your data with your supervising professor. OneDrive has excellent sharing tools that are really easy to use, especially with other UTA folks. So take advantage of those tools. There's really no need to go out and do Google Drive or Dropbox or some of these other tools, which are perfectly fine to use in your personal life. I might use Google Drive myself when I'm not at work, but when I am talking about the data that I produce and consume at UTA, I'm always using UTA's OneDrive. We have Question Pro for surveys. If your project or your research team need a website, we do have Campus Press. Collaboration, again, this is a Teams meeting. We use the tools built into Microsoft 365 in order to accomplish our collaboration. And over the past few years, we've gotten pretty good at using them. AI chatbot, again, if you're doing work at UTA, my rule of thumb is that if it's okay to store in UTA's OneDrive, it is probably okay to chat with UTA's Microsoft Copilot about it. Again, that's a rule of thumb. There's definitely limitations and considerations to that. But even the AI chatbot scope is covered at this point. A lot of these you can get to https://myapps.uta.edu. Myapps.uta.edu is your portal to all of the applications and software packages that UTA provisions to your UTA identity, who you are at UTA. But like I said, sometimes there may be a software package, there may be an app that you need that UTA doesn't already have. So certainly there is a way to initiate that request. The short version is you're going to have to submit a software review request, and that initiates a ServiceNow ticket into the IT organization. But then the IT organization, OIT, then we coordinate getting all the different reviews that have to happen in order to be able to approve a software review request. If you are a student and you need a particular piece of software or an app to do your study, you can't submit this form on your own. Your supervising faculty member is going to have to do it for you. The form does get into some detail, so just be prepared to sit down to interact with the form for 10 minutes. Vendor purpose, estimated cost. The state of Texas makes us ask, does it have a cloud component? The state of Texas makes us ask, does it have an AI component? And so as much as we try to make this form short and easy to do, it's the best mechanism that we have so far to deal with some of these real regulatory things that we have to answer, especially to the state and to others who provide oversight of what we do, about the kinds of software that we bring onto campus and that we use with our sensitive data, with your critical data. You want to complete a project, you want to finish a study. And so it really does matter who we hand that data to. We want to make sure that we can trust them and that we understand that they are going to handle our data appropriately. Answer the questions to the best of your knowledge. If there's just something that you don't know, you don't need to go, flipping over every rock. Just do the best you can. The process is going to kick in and fill in and get the detail that it needs. Sometimes it's not apps and software that you need. Sometimes it's purchasing help. So for small systems, so what I'm talking about is laptops, desktops, what we consider to be endpoints, sometimes tablets like an iPad. We have an endpoint request form. Again, you can go into ServiceNow. I show you the chain there. Students, same deal. If you need an iPad for a study, your supervising faculty member is going to need to go in and submit that endpoint request form. That form also asks for some detail. What of the pre-configured systems are you wanting to pick? What's your funding source? And there's even a box that if you need someone to consult with you about, hey, I don't quite know what I need, or I need some help picking, or even just to talk about your project and what might a good solution be. That's available there as well. And then when you say it's for research, actually my team catches those. Large or non-standard systems. So for example, if you have a computing that's supporting instrumentation, like you need to attach a computer to your atom sniffer so that it can run the atom sniffing software. If you're doing something that goes on a computer rack, you can consult the research support services team directly. Students, third verse, same song, supervising faculty will do that for you. Fill out the form to the best of your ability, and a research support services team member, sometimes maybe even me, will contact you to discuss that need. But we definitely want to work with you when you have to buy large systems, because large systems sometimes aren't so straightforward in how you house them, feed them, maintain them. There's all sorts of concerns that we have with large hardware that we want to make sure that we talk y'all through, so that you have a really good understanding of of the full picture of what it takes to bring a bigger system to campus. All right. Storing data outside of UTA. It is really important that you get approval before you store data, UTA data, outside of UTA. What do I mean by outside of UTA? So, you go to My Apps and you see, Question Pro, you see OneDrive, you see some of these other, you see Mentis. Those are all UTA systems. Those are inside of UTA. No problem. Teams, UTA's teams. This is inside UTA. Your personal Dropbox. You're collaborating with someone at another institution and they want you to store data with them and their system. Make sure that you do have an approval to do that. Because again, it's that same idea as the software. We want to make sure that we can trust the person or entity that we're storing data with, and that they'll protect our data appropriately. That's kind of where you get into trouble with, like, personal Dropbox, um, personal file sharing accounts. UTA really doesn't have any mechanism either to make sure that your data is secure or to provide any accountability.
আমি কি
Hello?
প্রত্যেকটা লোকে এখন করে পাবো?
And who's got a hot mic?
না, তাহলে
It is a week away from my wedding.
And I'm going to go ahead and mute that. Oh, she got to it before I did. Awesome. Chat. Okay. And that leads right into be careful about who you share data with, other people, vendors. When you store data with a corporation and you're not paying for it, they're making money off of it. Rest assured. Accidental sharing. This is a good one. You meant to share data with John Smith, at mavs.uta.edu. How many John Smiths at mavs.uta.edu, 1 through 50, are in the system? Make sure you pick the right one. That takes a moment of thoughtfulness and just making sure that you're hitting the right button for the right person. Disclosing data to the wrong party can be a problem. So be really, really careful when you're opening up data to someone else. Restricted regulated data will have additional rules. If you are dealing with restricted or regulated data, that will, you will be made aware of it either by your supervisor or through your proposal or one of a number of means, a variety of means. Don't assume that you can meet requirements for regulated data or restricted data on your own. That's always a collaboration with IT, with security, with IRB. And it can get really complicated and really expensive quick. The last thing that we want you to do is to encounter regulated data and you're not ready for it. So all that to say, ask questions, check in, collaborate if you're encountering regulated data. And if in doubt, don't share, don't copy, ask a question. Just we're here to help. We're here to help you navigate these questions about data. And I'd much, much rather have a pleasant conversation with y'all in order to help figure something out than to have to follow up on, a potential violation or even somebody coming in from the outside and saying, we notice a problem. It's always really stressful. AI. In all cases, if you're doing work for UTA, we ask you to follow UTA's AI guidelines. Your instructor, your supervisor, if you are a student, may have additional requirements around AI. And depending on who you're working with, such as federal sponsors, project sponsors, other partners, they may have other restrictions around AI. Take a moment to see what the rules are for the ball game that you're playing, and try to and follow this accordingly. UTA's logged in Copilot. Really conveniently now in Teams, there's a Copilot button that you can press, and it takes you right to UTA's instance of Copilot. There's also this link. Microsoft likes to change those links like every other week. But typically the way that I get to Copilot, UTA's Copilot these days, is through my Teams client. Like I said, probably okay to chat with a logged in Copilot if it's okay to store that data in your UTA OneDrive. You may have more nuanced situations. Again, if you're talking about regulated data, again, if you're talking about data that are particularly sensitive, get help, ask a question. Student identities. This one's a little subtle, but it can be important. So student accounts end after the student leaves the university. This is a happy time. You graduated. You did what you came here to accomplish. But things like your Question Pro account and your Teams chats and your OneDrive, you may lose access to those after you graduate. That makes sense. You're no longer affiliated to the university. You're off doing your next thing. So students, have a plan for that data that you need to keep after your time at UTA. If you're allowed to keep it, copy it to, take a copy of to a secure personal storage location, that kind of thing. if you don't know what I mean by data that you're allowed to keep, clear that up with your supervisor. But just know that you're going to lose that access and prepare for it. Faculty, most of the time, if you need to share with a student, it's a good idea for you as a faculty member to initiate that sharing to your student. So for example, you need to collaborate with a OneDrive folder. Faculty member, it's usually a better idea for you to make the OneDrive folder and to share it to a student than for the student to make a folder and share it to you. That way, when the student graduates, then you still have that folder and you still have all those files in that folder. You don't have to worry about it. When it goes the other way, you have to think about it. It's like, oh, Sally Maverick is graduating this semester. I really need to grab a copy of her OneDrive data, or that project folder that we were working on. I need to grab a copy of those Question Pro instruments. I need to grab a copy of that data in her Question Pro, those kinds of things. So faculty, where it's possible, it may be a better idea for you to initiate those sharings just so that you have the retention after a student separates from the university. Employee accounts ended employee termination. So if you stop being a GRA is a UTA employee. Again, all those accounts are going to be closed. Email's going to close. OneDrive's going to close. Question Pro, those kinds of things. Those all are going to be turned off. So again, be thoughtful, have a plan for what happens to the data after that time. Student employees, if you're a GRA, if you're doing work on behalf of your research team, maybe it's a better idea to use your employee identity, like to log into an instrument or to collect data inside of a OneDrive, log into a lab laptop, that kind of thing. If you're doing your own work for your own academic games, your student identity, you're working on your thesis, you're working on your dissertation, that kind of thing. It can sometimes get a little gray, but that's okay. Do the best you can, knowing what you know about accounts coming to an end and losing access to those resources when those accounts come to an end. All research projects have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Really, when we talk about the beginning, we're talking about designing a project, designing a study. Where are we going to get the data from? How do we get the data? That kind of thing. The middle, we have data, now we need to turn it into a result. That's your analysis platforms. That's your working storage. That's where you're keeping the data you're working on, inputs and outputs. How do you collaborate with others? How do you protect that data while you're working on it? You spend all this time collecting a survey. You stand out in the quad in the rain with an iPad, and you've done that for 10 days. How do you protect that data that you've spent a lot of time and effort to acquire? The decisions that you make about your working storage are really important at that point. At the end, you've written the thesis, you've written the dissertation, you've published the paper. Cleaning up that data, deciding what you're going to keep, deciding what you're not going to keep. That's an important end step, just so that we don't get into this, digital squirrel mentality of I'm going to keep everything forever. That may not be practical. In some cases, it would be appropriate. So as you go along these stages of the research data life cycle, know that you may have different tools and approaches as you move through that cycle. All these little decisions add up. Every time you interact with your data, you're making a decision about it. Are you going to put it in OneDrive, or, it's so much easier just to put it in my Google Drive because that's on my phone. Eventually that turns into your practices, and eventually that's going to turn into where your data ends up. So be thoughtful. Every time you have one of those little decisions, and definitely every time you have the big decision, I hope that you make the choice to handle your data appropriately, to use the tools that we have provisioned, and to get help when you need other tools, other resources. Who am I? Again, Edward Gonzalez, OIT Research Support Services. we love to hear from y'all. So anytime that we can help you with the IT that you need for your research, we do have an email address, oitrss@uta.edu. You can submit a request. You can find the Research Support Services section inside of ServiceNow. The two images in this presentation were made with good old logged in Microsoft UTA Copilot. I'm not sure what our horse friend is doing there. That, I guess, soldering iron doesn't look like it's plugged in, but he's a horse and he's giving it his best. Any questions for me? Either you want to unmute and speak up, or you can go ahead and throw it in the chat.
Hello, my name is Roman. I have a quick question.
Yes, Roman.
Speaking of that purchasing part, if I'm going to use the software that I wrote myself, will I need to purchase it anyhow, or should it be get registered anyhow? So what's the
Great question. So software that you use yourself, that's something that you're producing. It's not something that you're acquiring. And really, that's usually the inflection point, that if you're requiring it by the book, you need to get it reviewed. If it's part of what you're doing to produce the software so that you can conduct your analysis or even conduct your acquisition, I would view that as more of being inside of that side, the outputs that you're creating in that research cycle. Does that make sense? You're not reaching out and putting it in, you're generating it as part of your activity inside of that cycle. So I would say that software you write yourself, like a Python script or a shell script or something like that, that doesn't need review. As soon as you say, I'm going to go purchase something, that's a different story. As soon as you say, I'm going to make other people use it,
Yes.
that moves a little bit more into a gray area. And does it fit into your project context or not?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's tricky. If you want to contact me afterwards and we can have a fuller discussion about the nuances of your situation, always happy to do it. But typically the software that you write yourself as a grad student, as a faculty member, if we're not crossing that sort of commercial barrier, I'm not going to be looking for a review unless you start inflicting that software on other people.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Great question. Other questions? As always, pleasure to talk to y'all. Lisa, as always, I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, thank you so much, Edward. This is great, as always. Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions, just generally from anything that we've covered today that y'all have thought of?
I actually have one more question. Just a quick one. Those consent forms, after the research is done, should I submit the signed copies of those consent forms?
No, you don't have to submit them to the IRB. I realize some institutions have that practice, but here we just expect you to keep that as your research record, as part of your research record, for 3 years after the study is closed. So if for some reason you leave UTA before those 3 years are up, just make sure you identify another person who's going to be a custodian of that research record for you. And the reason that we require that it be retained is for audit purposes. If there was ever a question about how the study was conducted, we expect that the research record would still be there for us to come and look at to see what the documentation was. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I had a question in terms of relating to, I guess, interview question study population. If you're planning on doing interview questions and providing information in a different language for IRB approval, would that be a separate submittal, or would that be just all packaged and disclosed with one IRB submittal?
That's a good question. Yes, that would be all in one IRB submission. So if you have, like in this scenario where you would have a non-English material or procedures, you would propose that alongside, whatever you might be doing in English, and any translated documents, and the IRB would review it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Let's see. Oh, we have a question. What are the biggest electronic data security risks today? Let's see. Do we still have Edward on? I think he dropped off. I can't really speak to that. I would guess keeping your data safe is actually, I think, going to become easier. As long as you're using UTA managed and owned devices and tools and platforms, you've really lowered your risks a lot. And then make sure that you've outlined how you're protecting any electronic data in your IRB application, so that we have all the details about your data and how it's protected, so that if we see something that's not standard or common practice, or we know is problematic, we can help too. So, okay, well, if there's not any more questions now, feel free to reach out to us, to Regulatory Services. I think we've put that like in everywhere in this presentation. What our email address is, regulatoryservices@uta.edu. And that goes to our office, and IRB questions or any research question, one of us will pick it up and answer it. All right, so let's do the knowledge checks. So these are the questions that there's two. And the first person to get it correct gets that fast pass that we talked about at the beginning of the conference. So let me pull it up, and you just put the answer in the chat. Okay, so let's see, let me pull up. Sure. All right. Everybody might have already seen that. But here's the question. Just put the answer in the chat. I can read it out loud for everybody. When must researchers obtain IRB approval for a study involving human subjects? Is it A, after data collection begins? B, only if the study involves medical procedure? C, before recruiting or interacting with participants? Or D, only if the study is federally funded? So, all right. All right, since I'm screen sharing, I can't really see the chat. So let's see.
So it looks like,
Yeah,
let's see, it looks like Amber Rayleigh got it.
All right, great. Okay. Here's the other one. What is the purpose of informed consent in research? A, to collect personal data. B, to ensure participants understand the study and agree to take part voluntarily. C, to streamline the approval process for researchers. Or D, to assign participants to study groups. Let's see.
Okay, so I think Amber was the first again, but we'll go to the next one, and that's Andrea Germany is the winner for that one.
Okay. Okay, Great. Let me stop sharing. Okay, great. So for the Fast Pass winners, we'll contact you after the conference today to let you know and kind of the process, what to do to use your Fast Pass. All righty, everybody. Any last minute questions before we let you go? All right, great. Well, everybody, y'all have a great afternoon and stay warm this weekend. Bye.